The Russia-Ukraine war, of course, as we all know, has been on for about, 45 days now, or more than 45 days. And the various aspects to it. The most obvious one, of course, is that the Russian invasion is a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of an independent country, that is Ukraine. That's unquestionable. I think it's also become fairly evident as we go on that Russia has not achieved its objectives, at least in these last 45 days. There has been much loss of life, much destruction of property. There has been civilian casualties, unquestionably, and there have been various allegations of war crimes. We have also seen, I think, some of the harshest sanctions which have been imposed on any country by the United States, by NATO, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea. It's had a wider range of application than also any previous set of sanctions. The other aspect about this, of course, which has caused a lot of discussion and a lot of controversy, is India's response to this, what has often been called India's neutral stand, its refusal to impose the sanctions which a very large number of its strategic partners have imposed on Russia. We've also had in the recent past the pressure on India by a procession of leaders from a number of countries around the world, asking us to take a position, asking us to join the sanctions, and asking us to distance ourselves from our relations with Russia. So, in short, the drama continues. It's probably very good time now for us to pose some of the questions, Professor Pant, that you did in your introduction, as to where we are today in terms of the global order. What are the lessons for Europe, for the world, and specifically for India? And what can we expect going forward from this war? I think all of this we need to really reflect on. To start with, let me first start with this question of India's reaction. Why did we respond the way we did? Why did we not take a forthright position condemning Russia as we were expected to do by a number of countries? Now, I think a lot of the reasons have already come out in the public discourse. The nature of our relationship with Russia, particularly the defense cooperation, which has a very important significance, particularly in the context of what we are facing vis-a-vis China on our northern borders. So that is obviously an input into this. Another input into this is obviously also geography. You cannot run away from the fact that you share the same geography as Russia and China, with a very turbulent region in between, which is Central Asia, now Afghanistan, after the US and NATO have left it. And then you have Iran occupying it, you have West Asia, you have Turkey active in that region. So, you know, the turbulence in that region and the geopolitics of that region also requires us to think very strongly before we take precipitate action about precipitate response. We make a harsh response to what Russia has done in the region. But of course, there is also another aspect which is not much talked about, but which our leadership has actually expressed pretty clearly, though briefly, which is the fact, which is specific to this this particular conflict, that, you know, this particular conflict did not start with February 24. History did not begin with February 24 when Russia invaded Ukraine. It has a old history to it. At the end of the Cold War, 1990, we have the 2008, we have 2014. It has a long history. But the near history is that, you know, June 2021, when the US tried to sort of establish a predictable and stable relationship with Russia, and there were talks about Russia's so-called security concerns vis-a-vis NATO. In fact, the US and NATO recognized and even overtly accepted that some of Russia's concerns were legitimate, though not all of it could be met by the West. So there was a process of dialogue and diplomacy that was going on from June to December at least. And that it is when that failed that it tipped the scales towards war. And this is something that, you know, if you see what our Prime Minister said, particularly after the Quad Summit, he said that what we want is a return to dialogue and diplomacy, which is, in other words, look, you guys were talking to each other. You guys had recognized each other's problems. And at some point of time, you guys went into war. So please repair this, go back to dialogue and diplomacy. Therefore, as I said, history did not begin on February 24th. So all these factors together actually governed our response. Now, of course, one of the major points that the West has made to us is that, look, you guys, by calling on both sides to go back to diplomacy, by calling on both sides to be to exercise restraint, you are equating the aggressor with the victim. Now, look, that is a way of looking at it, and that's probably not incorrect. But we also remember how the world reacted when we had similar issues. In the last 20 years, the number of times that Pakistan has attacked India with its terrorism, and the number of clear evidence it was Pakistan was sponsoring this terrorism. What did the world do? They also called upon both sides to exercise restraint because, quite obviously, Pakistan was important to them for the war on terror. Pakistan was important to them in Afghanistan. So they had very good geopolitical grounds for not condemning Pakistan. So, basically our point is that we now understand though I must tell you that as a diplomat in those days, I was not at all happy with the Western response. But what I would say is that, just as your geopolitical perspectives governed your response then, please permit us the right to govern our response according to our geopolitical realities today. So, this is a very simple point. And the other point is, you talk about the violation of international law by a gross violation of international law. Again, let's be pragmatic about it. Every great power, every big power, when it has the opportunity to break international law in order to further its national interests, it does so. I'm not saying it's correct, but it's something that we've seen through the Iraq war in 2003 and the way China, for example, has gobbled up all of the islands in the South China Sea simply by taking them over. So one has to be sort of realist. One doesn't have to justify it, but one sees this happening, and therefore one knows this is what happens in the real world. Okay, coming to sanctions. The sanctions, of course, have been very harsh. As I said, they've been harsher than ever before. There is a wider range of acceptance than ever before. You have even neutral countries like Switzerland, which are saying that they're freezing Russian accounts. You have Japan, which has not in the past really been so happy to impose sanctions on Russia, imposing sanctions. Korea has done so as well. And we have, as I said, we've been under great pressure to also abide by the sanctions. But let's look at it a little bit more carefully. The sanctions have been, in spite of it being called the mother of all sanctions, I think they've been crafted very carefully. If you look at it, the most obvious one, of course, is that oil, gas, and coal, which the European Union imports from Russia, that has not been affected by sanctions. The financial sanctions, which were imposed very harshly, cutting off the banks from correspondent relationships with various Western banks, but also, most importantly, from the SWIFT messaging system, that also left a loophole open in terms of two banks. And that enabled trade of the European Union. The European Union is dependent on Russia for 61% of its oil, coal, and gas imports. And that continues. Nothing has happened to that. The US, by the way, has not banned uranium from the import list from Russia because uranium is required for its power plants, which really supply electricity to its homes, and it didn't want to increase electricity prices in homes. And in fact, later on, the US also lifted sanctions on fertilizer. They put them under the basic need because fertilizer prices in the US went up hugely because Russia and Belarus actually account for some 40% of the potash exports in the world. You look at Japan, for example, it imposed sanctions, but it said that its investments in Sakhalin-2 project will continue because they're required for its energy security. So every country in different ways has got itself a carve out from the sanctions. And look at the UK, for example. You had this Economist cartoon the other day, which showed President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi talking to each other and saying that, he has the blood of Ukraine on his hands. When talking about President Putin, is the blood of Ukraine on his hands. But then gleefully saying that we shall wash our hands with Russian oil. We can wash it off with Russian oil. I think this is extraordinary hypocrisy from The Economist, considering that the UK has not banned the import of oil from Russia either. In fact, Prime Minister Johnson said boldly in Parliament that we shall stop buying oil from Russia, and then added in a low voice, by the end of this year. And in fact, in the month of March, the UK import of oil from Russia actually increased. And they also said about natural gas that we shall consider a ban on Russian natural gas. So let's face it, sanctions may be harsh on the surface, but there are many carve-outs, and therefore it's particularly hypocritical to ask India not to circumvent sanctions. Firstly, sanctions are not, in India's view, illegal under international law, because it's only sanctions mandated by the UN that are illegal under international law. But leave that aside. Nowadays, it's become such a common currency of diplomacy that people have even stopped pointing it out. But I think when there are so many carve-outs for so many countries, people should not be surprised that we are doing something for the benefit of our people, for the economic benefit of our people. I mean, whether we are buying oil or whether we are protecting our investments, we have a huge hydrocarbons investment in Russia as well, about $15 billion right now. So I think this is something that we have to understand and accept. The other argument that we keep talking about, I mean, which keeps getting currency, is this, that, this is actually a fight of democracies versus autocracy. I'm afraid the evidence, and I think the former NSA Shiv Shankar Iyer wrote a very good piece in Foreign Affairs, in the American Foreign Affairs recently, pointing out that, look, even if you look at support for the Western line on Ukraine, there's a very large part of the world which is left not really greatly touched by this. They may have voted for the resolution condemning Russia. Even that, a much smaller number voted for the resolution that expelled Russia from the Human Rights Council. But, democracies in Latin America, democracies in Asia, of course, India being one, and other democracies have not really gone along the whole hog with this narrative. And there are countries, you have Turkey in NATO, which is not party to the sanctions. You have in West Asia, almost no West Asian country other than Kuwait, I think, actually criticizes Russia and are participating in sanctions. So we have to be careful about this narrative about democracy versus autocracy. In fact, in my view, this whole narrative about democracy versus autocracy is not valid in the post-Cold War world. The post-Cold War world is a very strange mix of countries which have various regional constructs have different interests. And it is not necessary that democracies have a common interest in their particular region. And of course, it is true even elsewhere. It isn't always that countries do not cooperate with non-democracies to achieve their ends. I mean, look at West Asia and look at Western countries' collaboration with West Asia without naming names. So I think in a post-Cold War world, we should be looking at not democracy versus autocracy, but as coalitions of joint interests to pursue one's own interests in various areas and in various regions. So this is, again, I think we need to be careful about this narrative. And therefore, alignment, as our External Affairs Minister often says, you can have convergence of interest with many countries, but you cannot have a congruence of interest. With no country do you have a complete totality of congruence of interest. And this is where we come to this question, which many of these foreign visitors have been telling us, they want to wean us away from Russia. They want to tell us not to depend on Russian arms, but to divert. Now, there are two things about this. One is, of course, when you talk about weaning away somebody, it sounds like a stern parent telling a child not to take chocolate because it's bad for its health. But that lecturing aside, if you talk about India's Russia defense dependence, it's actually coming down, and we do not require a Western country or any other country to tell us to wean ourselves from the dependence. We've been trying to do this for the last 20 years. And if you look at even the latest figures, if you look at SIPRI, which put out its arms transfer figures lately, I have the figures here, that, in 2012 to 2016, 69% of our arms came from Russia. Whereas from 2017 to 2021, only 46% came from Russia. So we are actually trying to diversify. We are trying to reduce our dependence on Russia. And by the way, our arms imports from the US skyrocketed in the period in the last 10 years or 12 years or so. This is also important. And if this has not happened faster, it is not because of lack of political will, it is because of other realities, which are a whole range of realities. You know, it is technology issues, interoperability issues, bureaucracy issues, mindsets. So, you know, these are all the things that make the process a little slower, but we do not need, we understand fully well that dependency on any one source, especially for arms, and now you have the Atmanirbharta drive as well. So all of these, it's very important to understand that this is not India's choice of defense dependence. It is India's efforts for acquiring independence from external defense reliance that is taking it. Now, the other point, of course, is when you say wean away from Russia, you can't wean away from geography. Russia is there, as I said, it's a geopolitical presence. And the other point really, which people do not, which people miss, that today's confrontation is not with Russia, it is with Putin. You know, everything is because they feel that Putin is driving Russia in an autocratic, in an anti-West, in a brutal fashion away from democracy. Now, you cannot assume that Putin will be there forever. Russia will be there forever. And therefore, again, this is an aspect that we need to keep in mind, that also when you see the way in which now the world is acting against Russians, not Russia. You talk and see how the Bolshoi theater has been banned, how Russia has been booted out of the World Cup, how Russian individuals around the world are being asked, either you condemn Putin's invasion or you will not be accepted. The UK sports minister has said that, you know, Russian players cannot enter Wimbledon unless they criticize Putin's invasion. And the ATP website, for example, Association of Tennis Professionals, every player there has a flag against his name. Russians do not have a flag against his name. Now, you're depriving now a whole nation of its identity because one leader of that country has done something. And we need to, I think, judge this a little bit more carefully and see, you can't cancel a nation. You can cancel a leadership if you like. Of course, my time is running out, so I'll very quickly end here saying one of the things that we need to look at is the fact that the information, whoever is winning or losing the war on the ground, the information war has been clearly won by the Ukrainians. They are dominating the airwaves. All that you see and hear everywhere around is only that, the Ukrainian side of the picture. And even if you see the vote in the United Nations General Assembly, you know, which condemned Russia for human rights violations. What did India say? India said that we need an independent evaluation. So far, no independent evaluation has taken place. We've had the narrative from one side and we have gone on the basis of that narrative. So again, the information, the fact that the information war is dominating, it should be a lesson for us as well. You know, the way we have been unable to project an explanation for our actions, the explanation for our posture. I think the strategic communications of our security and foreign policy establishment does need to be looked at more carefully about how. Finally, what is the end game? War is going on. There are talks going on the side. Russia and Ukraine are talking to each other. They claim, Russians claim some forward movement on that. The Ukrainians say there has been no forward movement. But let's face it, this is not only a Russia-Ukraine war. This is actually a war, this is actually a confrontation between Russia and NATO and the United States. And therefore, whatever comes out of it only when the US and NATO decide to take the settlement in a particular direction. While as far as you pile sanctions on Russia, which is not going to stop Russian behavior, change Russian behavior, and as long as you keep supplying arms to Ukraine, essentially US and NATO are fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. And they're also fighting Russia for the destruction of the Ukrainian economy. Ukraine today is the poorest country in Europe in GDP terms, in GDP per capita terms, whether it's nominal or PPP. So we need to now, and coming back to the original question, it is a war for a European security architecture. As long as the post-Cold War European security architecture does not integrate into it in a harmonious fashion, the largest country of that region, you're not going to get an equilibrium. And this war, if it ends up in a kind of a quick fix, is only going to exacerbate the tensions for the future. Finally, we need to look at also Asia. Just as the post-Cold War architecture in Europe has not been fixed, as the same thing you can say for Asia. The impact of this war, how will it be on Asia? How will it impact US focus on Asia and the Indo-Pacific? How will it impact on Russia-China relations? How will China be, how will Russia be in Asia at the end of this war? All of these, I think, are questions that we, as Indians, have to think about very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Raghavan. I think a number of the points that you finished off with, perhaps we can come back to them in the second round. Let me go back. Let me now invite Nandan for his comments. Nandan, if given your engagement and your appreciation of the Russian context and your long-time observer of that, I think it would be useful for a lot of our students to get a sense as to where Russia is coming from in this crisis, and what is as Ambassador Raghavan said, history did not start on February 24th. So where do we look for the start of history? Because Fukuyama said end of history in 1990s. So are we? I mean, was that the end of history then and the start of a new history? How do we interpret that security architecture that was created in early 1990s? And I think what are the sorts of foundations of this conflict? How far do we go as students and scholars of Russia and Europe to understand the present crisis? I think if you can elaborate on some of those themes as well, it would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pant, and thank you, DSDA, for inviting me. I will try and respond to some of the queries that Professor Pant has posed. I hope I have the wherewithal for that. And of course, my task is made significantly easier by the fact that Ambassador Raghavan covered virtually everything else that I wanted to speak about in his address. It's really sort of encompassed all various aspects of the conflict in Ukraine, how it affects India, and how India should be looking at the conflict, even if he did not tell us what India's position should be, let's say, at a later stage of this conflict. However, let me start with 2-3 things that I have, before I address the questions raised by Mr. Pant, Professor Pant. One is, there are 2-3 myths that this war has destroyed. The first one is not a myth, but it has shown the weaponizing of finance. Finance has become a full-fledged weapon of war. Till now, we had limited sanctions, but the kind of sanctions that have been arrayed against the Russians display that finance can be almost as effective a weapon as probably hypersonic missiles. Of course, there are multiple hypocrisies in the way these sanctions have been sort of carved out, which was pointed out by Ambassador Raghavan, with the exceptions that are made for the participants in this war, because these are those who were sanctioning who've made exemptions for themselves. However, while the rest of the world is supposed to adhere to these sanctions in their entirety. Another bit of probably hypocrisy. But again, as Ambassador Raghavan said, this is great powers do what they are able to, and the rest of the world either resists it or just lumps it. I mean, there are not many choices in this particular thing. So weaponization of finance. This weaponization of finance also brings us to the fact that actually this is not a war merely between Russia and Ukraine. This is a war between, this is a point touched upon by Mr. Raghavan, but this is genuinely a war between Russia and the extended West. In my book, Ukraine is merely a proxy in this. And Ukrainian land is being used to sort out some legacy issues, if you want. And the third element that I wanted to highlight is it has also displayed, destroyed rather than displayed, destroyed the myth of objectivity of Western media. Because now, having eliminated all Russian media, which in any case we have earlier also dismissed as propaganda, we are imbibing all our information from the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, BBC, and the like. And it's self-evident now, seeing day by day reportage, that what we are getting is not even just one-sided. It is not, the one side that they are covering is also not covered adequately. In fact, there is very selective coverage attempting to formulate public opinion in one particular direction. In fact, if you ask me, this is probably far better propaganda than something that RT has, because RT at least doesn't make any bones about the fact that they represent the Russian state and the interests of the Russian state. The BBC and CNN definitely don't say that, while at this point in this war, New York Times and Washington Post appear to be performing that role that RT performs for the Russian. And this does not, having been in the media for many years, 25 years of my career, I definitely regret this, because I think that Western media has played a very positive role in many instances, but this is not one of those instances where they have covered themselves in glory. Now, this brings us to where history starts. We could go back to the origins of the Russian state. We could go to the 9th century, but that is a very long lecture. That'll take several hours. So I would suggest that we fast forward to 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and let us look at that as our recent history that has led us up this particular street. And if you look at that particular street, you will discover that when the street was built, there were certain understandings of how traffic will flow, in which direction there will be further development of the street, where the flyovers will come and all. The understandings were not probably sort of etched in some kind of municipal plan. However, broadly, there was this understanding. Then came the question of 1994, removing nuclear weapons from some of the collapsed Soviet republics. And at that point, the United States had no hesitation whatsoever, roping in the Russians to try and help resolve this problem, because both of them shared concerns about proliferation. And so defanging Ukraine and Kazakhstan was essentially a joint venture between the Americans and the Russians. And today you have a situation where the Ukrainians are regretting that they gave up nuclear weapons. But the effective fact is that it is in that agreement that all the problems start, because when that agreement is made, the Russians and several other states sign a declaration that guarantees the territorial integrity of Ukraine and Kazakhstan, in return for which these states give up their nuclear weapons. These nuclear weapons are taken to Russia, and then subsequently, many of them are destroyed in collaboration with the United States. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia, particularly in the first 3-4 years, was looking at being integrated into the West. Russia, having been a superpower, clearly did not want to be integrated as a junior partner, but was willing to at least accept some obligations of a junior partner if the modalities of that could be somehow worked out and Russia retained some of its status. However, despite repeated attempts, even in the times of the infamous Foreign Minister Kozyrev and President Yeltsin turned out to be more of a nationalist than anticipated, because on the issue of NATO, he was not willing to give. I would advise you to read Russia Hand and several other accounts that have now come out of declassified documents in the United States, which indicate that way back in '95, the Russians resisted any plans for NATO expansion. However, NATO expansion does take place in 5 separate waves. And today we find that NATO is, barring Ukraine, Belarus, and Georgia, and of course Moldova, NATO is everywhere else around Russia, including the Baltics, which are neighbors of Russia. Now, this is clearly not a situation that is to the liking of the Russians. And plans of allowing membership of the Ukraine into NATO, which subsequently in 2017, I think, I may be wrong, please do correct me, got incorporated into the constitution of Ukraine as an article that Ukraine will seek membership of NATO, is something that was unacceptable to the Russians. They repeatedly raised this. And then in June last year, I think the United States and Russia began a discussion in which there was much hope. The Geneva process did generate a lot of hope that some kind of understanding would be arrived at, and that the Russians and the West would arrive at some kind of accommodation or at some kind of new security understandings, and the tensions in Europe would be significantly reduced. We in India were definitely interested in that because we wanted greater focus from our consequential partner, our consequential strategic partner, the United States. We want their focus in Asia, again, as something that Mr. Raghavan mentioned towards the end of his presentation. However, our best hopes were not to be. And the trigger, in my opinion, again, I may be wrong, but this is just my opinion, I think the trigger for the war was the failure of the Normandy process. In 2014, when Ukraine, the coup, if you want, displaces a legitimately elected president, albeit a venal, corrupt president, but he is displaced by definitely not constitutional methods, while foreign ministers of Poland, Sweden, France are all traipsing around the square on which the people who are displacing him are assembled. And of course, that led to the annexation of Crimea by the Russians. Russians call it incorporation back into the motherland, as it were, of a territory on March 18th. The tensions were self-evident, but again, the lesson wasn't learned from that. And the Minsk agreement, which is the result of those developments in 2014, envisage a set of steps which in theory should have brought about an element of peace. And these Minsk agreements are countersigned by European leaders. So they are party to it. And then subsequently, because Ukraine was reluctant to implement some of the steps outlined in Minsk, a Normandy process is started, so that because in the Minsk process, the Russians refused to negotiate with the Ukrainians directly because they said that they were not party to the conflict. The conflict was between the Eastern republics, which were wanting to break away, and the Ukrainian government in Kiev. Russia was not a party to this. According to the Minsk agreements, that is true, strictly legally correct. So the Normandy process was started that brings the Ukrainian leadership and the Russian leadership to the same table. Now, the Normandy process was to expedite the Minsk agreement. The last meetings were held in January in Paris and in Berlin. I think the difference I mean, the first was 10 days, subsequently 10 days after that, the second one was held. The Russian representative, Mr. Kozak, after each of those meetings came out and held a public press conferences. What he said in both those press conferences has not been denied by anybody. And what he said is very, very simple. Ukraine is refusing to implement certain clauses about autonomy for Russian language and Russian speakers and the regions that these Russian speakers occupy. Ukraine is not willing to take steps on the going forward with the principle of neutrality, and that the Western powers, that is namely France and Germany, don't appear to be interested in applying any pressure on them to fulfill the Minsk agreements. In Berlin, the second meeting, he comes out and he says that as far as Russia is concerned, this is a dead end. The Minsk agreements, the Western powers don't appear to be interested in bringing Ukraine to the table to negotiate what Ukraine had signed. In the meantime, just as an interesting aside, the president who's signed this agreement, Poroshenko, is brought in front of the Ukrainian parliament on charges of treason. Imagine that, for signing this agreement. I mean, it's just comical. And in that series of sort of comedy of errors, the Russians decided that they had no option. I am in total agreement with Ambassador Raghavan that whatever they felt, I do not think war is necessarily the weapon to sort out these differences. But I also understand where the Russians are coming from, and therefore would follow the principle that it definitely takes two hands to clap. You cannot produce that sound with just one hand. You need some other object. And in this particular case, it is quite clear that solution to this problem does not lie in Istanbul. Yes, they can negotiate, they can come to some kind of understanding of common interest, but the solution to this table is available only when the United States joins this conversation and when the United States directs the others to move in a particular direction. Right now, I think, unfortunately, the United States is sniffing regime change. It feels that it can, through these debilitating sanctions and through a protracted war, it is hoping that the demon Putin will disappear and the ghost of his shall be exorcised from this world. But unfortunately, I am afraid that that process is going to be rather long. They may succeed, I don't know. Knowing the Russians for so many years, I doubt. But let us assume for a moment that there is a little bit of sanity in the plans that Washington is dreaming up, or rather Victoria Nuland is dreaming up, and that regime change does take place, but I suspect it's going to take more than a couple of years for that to happen. There will be many more deaths. There will be many more civilian horrors that will happen. At the end of the day, and the bottom line will be that Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine will be lost. There will be independent republics or Russian-dominated republics, call them what you may. But that will happen, because that I don't think anyone is willing to stop. The only way that can be stopped is if NATO soldiers come on the ground in Ukraine. But as Ambassador Raghavan pointed out, this is a war that the West is willing to fight till the last Ukrainian soldier. And maybe in that is a lesson for us, because in our war with China, let us hope that we get more than just the help that the Ukrainians are getting. I will end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nandan. I think, and just let me welcome Nidhi, has just joined. Nidhi Razdan, she's a consulting editor with NDTV, and she's, Nidhi, welcome. Nandan, there are a number of points you make, and I think some very interesting ones, which we can come back to in a bit. But I would also like, maybe in the second round, to probe you a bit on the fact that that operationally, tactically, and even strategically, Russia does not come out, in this war as one where there was a very thought-out plan behind this campaign. So it is not simply a tactical defeat, that you have long stretched convoys without soldiers to fight. You have, losses of generals, but also the fact that if the idea was not to have NATO on your doorstep, Sweden and Finland will be NATO members. They are applying. So even strategically rearming of Germany, lots of things are happening which will have profound impact on the way Russia's equation with Europeans gets set. So I would like you to respond to them in the second half. But let me welcome Nidhi. Nidhi, you were not here, but both Ambassador Raghavan and Nandan, they made two interesting points, and I think given your background, perhaps you can engage with those points. One is this idea of information warfare. And I think both Nandan and Ambassador Raghavan made this point that, look, if you're looking at the information warfare at the moment, Ukraine has won this space. We are only getting one-sided narratives. The Western media is portraying it in a very one-sided manner. And that is coloring a lot of our perception about the war. We are not getting, the narrative is tilted to one side. Do you as a media professional also get that sense? And how is India covered this campaign? How has Indian media covered this war and crisis? And what do you think are the lessons broadly, both in terms of foreign policy as well as in terms of information warfare that is now such an important part of our foreign policy and national security thinking? If you can highlight some of those points, that would be great. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Harsh. And I'm sorry for joining late, the hazards of my job at the moment, running from one interview to the next. But it's very interesting, the points that you mentioned there. In terms of, the media and information warfare, look, propaganda war is these days half the war won. And it's very clear that the Ukrainians have mastered that. You see President Zelensky has, been addressing parliaments of different countries, and he has spoken to Arnab Goswami in India, but that's another story. But he is very effectively channeling the power of social media. Whether it was getting out of his suit and tie right at the beginning of the invasion, getting into these army fatigues, these olive t-shirts, very carefully crafted, going out onto the streets with his cell phone and showing people what had happened in the initial days of this invasion. And he hasn't removed that t-shirt. He continues to be in that very war-like mode. So whoever is advising him on media, PR, propaganda is doing it very, very well. He's effectively using these parliaments. I think he's addressed more than 10 now, including the US Congress, the British Parliament, etc. And he's very effectively using that to get his message across. Whereas on the other side, I think as I'm talking to you, I was just listening to the news editor saying that I think we've got the first pictures of Vladimir Putin in weeks. I don't know where he's made an appearance, but we haven't really seen him for a long time, which has fueled its own conspiracy theories that he's sick and he has this problem and, he's had thyroid cancer and whatever, other mystery illnesses. So the messaging has been very, very different. In terms of, the way the Indian media has covered it, I would say that, frankly, the print media has very little coverage of the actual ground situation. And this seems to be a made-for-TV war in that sense, because clearly some television channels have gone there to report on the spectacle of war. I think some have done an exceptionally good job in very calm reportage, just showing us what they are seeing. Maybe that is based on the individual personalities of reporters, but the rest of it, frankly, is an embarrassing tamasha. Where you stand on top of some tank or some truck that's been blown up, and as usual, the media gets into so it kind of hyperventilates here in India in particular, and doesn't really go deep enough into issues and show us the suffering of people. So some have done a very good job, others have not. And you don't see, as I certainly don't see the print media having as many reporters on the ground, reflecting the coverage per se. Naturally, I think that when you look at the media coverage overall, obviously it is dominated by the Western narrative. They have people on the ground there, and they are sort of very much on the Ukrainian side of this. But I think, frankly, in many cases, I don't know what other side there is to tell. I don't understand as a as a journalist, also the Russian, I mean, we have to put the Russian perspective, but in this century, to see a big power invading another country, which is clearly not your equal, invading another country and its sovereignty, the killing of civilians. I think Bucha has also shaken India's conscience as well. That to me was a turning point, even in the way that India has been now responding. It may not mark a big shift in how India has approached this, but just the horrors of seeing civilians being killed like that has prompted India to give its strongest statements, even on this particular incident. So I think the media needs to also call out things for what they are. We know that the Russian regime is not a democratic one, that they are ruthless with their critics and dissenters, and where they don't believe in a free press. Putin has shut down effectively most media organizations in his country that are critical of him or his government. And therefore, I mean, if the West, frankly, is calling a spade in many cases, then I'm not saying their coverage is perfect, but it may really not be so far from the truth as far as what is happening on the ground. I'm not a diplomatic expert. I've covered foreign policy for more than 20 years now as a journalist. And look, I personally believe that India had adopted a very wise position in the beginning to just essentially stay out of this and not needle Russia by directly naming it, abstaining. I think India has to look out for its own interests. Every country does that. And to base these arguments from a US perspective, which is about democracies coming together, is frankly hypocritical. We've seen the US is happy to engage with autocracies everywhere else. It has a very good relationship with the Saudis. It's gone and turned to Venezuela for the purchase of oil because it's shut down supplies from Russia. And therefore, they don't have any problems in engaging with whoever they deem fit for their own interests. So why shouldn't India do the same? However, I think that as this invasion has progressed, as this war has progressed, Bucha, something like that does make things a little more uncomfortable for India. And I think that if, as the world's largest democracy, and I'm not saying this because the Americans are saying this, but I think if we value ourselves as leaders in a democratic world and we seek to distinguish ourselves from China, it is a bit jarring now to see that we have not even named Russia when it comes to these killings. So I do wonder whether India can sustain this position of sitting on the fence for very much longer. Those are initially my comments. I'm happy to sort of take this to a Q&A, but I don't know if we should be comfortable with comparing ourselves to, let's say, how Turkey reacts to something, or the Saudis react to something, or the way the Chinese react to something. And I think the experts on this panel, I would want to ask them long term, that given the Russia-China axis now, given that Russia may just end up being a junior partner of China for a while in that axis, what is in India's long-term interest, given the Chinese aggression at the LAC at the moment? Is it in our interest to upset the balance within the Quad, looking at our own security interests? So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Nidhi. And I think some of the points that you have raised, I will take them to Ambassador Raghavan, because that was exactly the point at which Ambassador Raghavan actually concluded his initial remarks, which is what are the implications of what is happening in Ukraine? What are the implications for the Indo-Pacific, and what sort of position India can and should adopt going forward, given that the challenges are becoming more normative, and given that we are talking of UN Charter, international law, territorial integrity and sovereignty, those sorts of issues around which we are framing the discourse on Ukraine increasingly. So Ambassador Raghavan, if I can come to you, I have these 2 points to ask you. One is, of course, if you can respond to what Nidhi was suggesting, and also this broader idea as to how, what is the larger issue here in terms of looking at it from the perspective of hypocrisies all around. International politics is hypocritical, we know that. But within that hypocritical framework, where do you find normative consensus with like-minded? How do we find normative consensus with like-minded countries? And I think the other point that I wanted to touch upon, and perhaps Nandan can also pick up on it, is this the future of India-Russia relationship? Ambassador, you pointed out that, look, We know that we are reducing our dependence on Russia. The numbers speak for themselves. Our foreign minister has made it very clear that, look, if you look at the energy transaction, it's less than 1% or 1%. Compared to other countries, it's nothing. But I think that the future of India-Russia relationship, in the context of what is happening in Ukraine, in the context of Russia emerging, or likelihood of Russia emerging as a junior partner to China, what is the future of this relationship? Because we know that it's a very difficult, it has been a difficult trajectory for this relationship. We have been trying to diversify, we have been trying to engage Russia on economics and energy, but that has not borne a lot of fruit. So when you extrapolate from what is happening, and when you look at the long-term trend lines, where do you see this relationship going? And perhaps if you can, engage our students and our faculty and all of us on this issue, and I'll take this to Nandan later on. Thank you, sir.
Want me to start?
Yes.
Okay. Let me start with Bucha, of which Nidhi spoke eloquently. Now, what we saw on our TV screens was horrible. There's no doubt about that. The narrative that we've heard is horrible. There's no doubt about that. There are accusations of human rights allegations, no doubt about that. But let me come back to the same point. It is all from one source. Yes, you have said that the Russian regime is capable of violence, it is capable of ruthlessness, but it still remains to be proved that the Russians actually did this. The Russians claim that the nationalists in Ukraine set this up in order to frame them. I'm not saying that is true, but I'm saying that, look, when you have an international event, you need an independent investigation. And that's what India said as well, both in the United Nations Security Council and in the United Nations General Assembly. And mind you, the presence of nationalists, ultra-nationalists in Ukraine is very well established, except that it has been blacked out by the international media. You can go back to the Western media before this war and you'll see many, many, many examples of how the ultra-nationalists in Ukraine have been very violently killed Russian speakers in Ukraine. Anyway, all that is separate. My point really is that, we should judge an event after an impartial international investigation has taken place. That's all I'd like to say about that. And therefore, I'm saying that one incident like that should not govern India's position on Russia or on the war as such. I mean, if you say that we were right before Bucha, I will not accept that because of Bucha we have become wrong. I think we need to consider the position a little bit more carefully. And arising out of this also is this question: should we be seen with Saudi Arabia? Should we be seen with Syria? Should we be seen with China? I think in international affairs, where pragmatism is the ultimate touchstone of a country's behavior, and where its national interests sometimes require it to ignore the autocracy of others, I think that's what we need to be looking at. Look at our neighborhood. Look at the way we are dealing with countries in our neighborhood. They're not models of democracy. We're not calling them out either, because we have good reason not to call them out. So let us focus on our national interest. Let us understand that the entire world is hypocritical, as you yourself pointed out, and therefore deal with the world as we would like to deal with in order to promote our interests. Now, as far as the Quad goes, are we actually striking a discordant note in the Quad? Let's be very clear. The United States is our most important bilateral relationship today. There can be no two ways about it. It is our most important bilateral relationship. But there are areas where the United States cannot help us. And that is in the Eurasian landmass. You see, India, unlike all the other Quad countries, has two flanks, a maritime flank and a continental flank. And when you're looking at the continental flank, you're looking at this area which is sandwiched between Russia, China, and India. You see Central Asia, you see Afghanistan, you see Iran, you see West Asia. Where after the Americans have left Afghanistan, there is actually chaos there. There is turbulence there. we need to protect our interests there. And Russia is important for that. And we need to salvage, I would say we need to salvage what we can out of the Russian relationship in order to make sure that we can protect our interests there. And that is in fact the reason why we are walking through these hoops, if you like, in our reaction to this. The other point is what I said earlier. Look, everybody is against Vladimir Putin. Russia as a geographic entity, Russia as a landmass above us, Russia as the home of hydrocarbons and natural resources will remain long after Vladimir Putin has gone. And therefore, I think we need to keep that in mind as well. Geography is a very important part of geopolitics. So we need to put all that into the mix. I understand that there is such a thing as morality outraged. And I do understand that all countries do have to keep a certain modicum of moral principles at the heart of their foreign policy. But you need to balance that against pragmatic geopolitical, geographical compulsions, if you like. And I think that's the difficult process that we are in the way we are trying to carve our position in the post-Cold War world. I'm done. I think I've answered what I was asked to answer.
All right. Nandan, can I come to you? I raised the two questions. One was about, where do you see Russia's, how do you see Russia's campaign, and what do you see the long-term effects of this for Russian foreign policy and national security? The other one is just talk a bit about India-Russia relations as they stand today, and what are the parameters on which to judge whether there is potential there, or are we looking at a fundamental relationship that is in decline, and we are trying to manage that decline in an elegant manner?
Thank you, Professor Pant. 2 points, Nidhi. I think you pointed out very well that eventually, whether we like it or not, we're getting, this is the information we are getting. And we really don't have any other sources to compare it with. But the problem I see with this is, while some of the, at 2 levels, at fundamental level, we have stopped seeing reportage. In the old days, when you opened newspapers, you knew the front page had reportage, opinions were somewhere inside. Today, when you're looking at the front page of whether it is New York Times or Times of India, you're seeing a description of events which sounds like reportage, but is selectively picked by the reporter, who has already got an opinion and therefore is placing facts accordingly. I'll give you this example of Bucha, which you raised, and you said the Russians are at fault. They probably are. I'm not going to get into that dispute. But 2 things I'd like to point out here. The 2-3 accounts on Twitter that I knew about, which were actually providing alternate information, run by US Marines, members of US intelligence, not by any Russians or any Russian scholars. They were pointing out inconsistencies in the story that was originally coming out of Ukraine and subsequently put out by the Western media. Those accounts were shut down. They are not accessible anymore. For what reason? They were not indulging in any anti-national sort of campaign or something. Scott Ritter merely pointed out that the Russians left Bucha on March 31, that the bodies were found mysteriously on April 3. What happened to those 3 days? That on April 1 and 2, it is the Ukrainians who came into the city. There was no reportage of any, the mayor spoke to the world. He didn't speak of any bodies suddenly. Now, this is the only question he raised. He's not saying the Russians did not do it. He's merely saying that there are some inconsistencies. Point number 2, just as a matter of clarification, look, a very high percentage of the Ukrainian army comprises these nationalist battalions. They're not the regular army. They have been raised and they function outside within the system of Ukraine. They are part of the defense system. Unfortunately, they've been recognized as a kind of a paramilitary force, and they operate independently of the government. So what happens there is very difficult to think. The third thing regarding Bucha, I will tell you, is that the Prime Minister said it rightly. We have played around with his words probably, but he said there should be an impartial inquiry. He didn't say independent, because independent inquiry without Russia will be accepted by the whole world. But an independent inquiry without Russia would not be an impartial inquiry. So therefore, I think this thing of, I think India has missed a beat on this particular resolution when we use the word independent instead of impartial, implying that it is built into this word. But given the way that we are dealing with Russia at this point of time, I don't think it is impartial in that sense. The second is future of India-Russia. Harsh, look, one point is, I don't know why everyone is assuming that dependency and diversity means a specific thing. I think our dependence on Russia is reducing, but diversity does not necessarily mean that we should buy from the US or Israel or France or somewhere else. I think when diversity is being spoken about, it is of creating a capacity for India to develop its own armaments and stand on its own feet. No great nation has ever been a great nation on the basis of imported arms. We need to develop the military industrial complex of our own country independently. The second point is that look at what happened in the 2+2 in the meeting between Austin and Rajnath. What is Rajnath Singh telling the US? That, look, Boeing and all the others, he's telling them, come and make in India. We are not buying. If you want to get into the Indian market, you come and make it in India. Sell it wherever you want. But this buying business is outmoded. So coming back to that, I think India-Russia relationship, India-US relationship, all these relationships depend on how we and they write themselves into India's development story. Because for India, its internal challenge is the most consequent challenge. And I think our most consequent partner, as Ambassador Raghavan said, and I agree with it, the United States, it must look at that particular challenge that India is facing. India is not only an sort of an ally on the security front. India has multiple other challenges which the United States must see how it can help address. And unfortunately, right now, all we are talking about is security. Third is, I don't share everyone's, how do I put it, enthusiasm for the Quad. For the simple reason that when it originally started, I clapped with hands and feet. I thought this element would have a very strong security element. Then I was told, no, we will not talk about the security element, but we will do this. It will be under covers. There will be interoperability and all kinds of things. But today, when I look at it, I realize that the security element, whether it is by Indians or anyone else, is totally diluted. Why? Because we suddenly discover an AUKUS. Why couldn't the United States and Britain give me that nuclear submarine? I would tomorrow leave Russia. I would sign out of the Russian relationship tomorrow if they would offer me that nuclear submarine. Not happening. Harsh, I know it disappoints you, but it is not happening even for a decade. So that is where I vote with my hands and feet to not write out Russia from our relationship. It is too early. Yes, it is consequential on the Asian landmass. It is a consequential partner, but it is also part of the story right now for India's great power ambitions. The day we give up those ambitions, then of course everything else changes. But I agree with Ambassador Raghavan. Bucha is not rewriting our approach to this war. I think if anything, this war needs to be brought to a halt very, very quickly, because India's interests are really going to suffer in the long term on a variety of other fronts also. But the way for this war to be brought to a halt quickly is only one and single one, that the most powerful nation in the world exercise its responsibility and put a halt to it. And we all know there is only one most powerful nation in the world, and that is not Russia, and neither is that Ukraine. Thank you.
Thanks, and then I think on AUKUS, I will just make a comeback here in the sense that India, I think, and many in India, and I'm surprised now that you have joined that bandwagon, also want to have it both ways. See, if AUKUS is something amongst their alliance partners, India often says that we don't want to be an alliance partner of the US, right? We want to be away from that relationship. So I don't think we are getting that technology unless we declare we are open for an alliance embrace, but we are not. So I don't think we can have our cake and eat it too.
Harsh, you know that we are splitting hairs. Even if we agree to be an ally, we are not getting that technology.
I'm not so sure.
I'm saying that if the US tells me, I will give you, provided you're an ally, I will be their ally. But I need a commitment.
I'm not so sure, Nandan. I think Ambassador Raghavan would come back. But Nidhi, let's bring it back to because you raised the point about the perception of media and how media management, and I think that we have had a lot of discussion around it. This is something that of course media is covering now, but we also know that the media's role in covering wars and conflicts has been quite significant since the early 1990s. The first Gulf War was the first time when the media was already positioning itself well. When you look at let's take two conflicts, right? Let's take Iraq, for example, the second Gulf War, and let's take what is happening now. What is your assessment? Because media has been very critical of the US as well. When Iraq war happened, I mean, there was a lot of criticism, at least in the initial phase, at least in the later phases. Initially, it was all about WMDs and I think enthusiasm. But later on, it evolved where America was, seen as an aggressor, moving out of the international law framework, etc. So when you compare, a war like that being covered by especially Indian media, Indian sensibilities, and when you look at this, because we have different relationships with these countries. Russia, as we have been talking about, has been a long-standing partner. There is still a level of elite trust. America trust factor has been developing over the years. We are still not there yet in terms of trust. There are still lots of people who question whether America can be trusted. That's a big question. So when you look at this coverage of these two countries from a diplomatic point of view, as a long-standing observer, do you see any trend lines there? This is more about our approach to these countries, or this is about media taking an independent position on these issues and getting sources wherever they are getting it from?
Firstly, I think let's disabuse ourselves of the notion that the media anywhere is entirely independent anymore, especially in our own country. That's laughable. It's not. And a lot of the narrative on the way the Indian media covers foreign policy comes frankly from the MEA and the spin that it gives. And it has always been like that. So there's never any dispassionate coverage of, say, even, with our neighbors, India, Pakistan in particular. It has a certain lens through which it is done. And I think, the West, certainly, you talked about the first Gulf War. There were huge problems in the way embedded journalism was done at the time and the kind of reporting they did. They didn't ask the right questions about weapons of mass destruction, etc. And the rest is history. Perhaps later, those questions started coming up and the media tried to hold their own government to account. But the way they actually covered the conflict initially was, completely from an embedded lens. And that's how they did it. I don't understand, though. I mean, when Nandan says that, it is the United States that can end this war, I mean, Putin has clearly been the aggressor here. How do you invade another country? I come to this point. It's mind-boggling that you invade another smaller country. You are a nuclear power. And why should Putin get a free pass for that? I mean, I just ask, you know Russia better than I do, certainly. But that is the one thing I don't understand. I also don't understand. I find that the Indian coverage or commentary about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine is, apart from the op-ed pages and these Zoom conferences, is social media driven. And I find the Indian reaction so schizophrenic, because everyone who's today siding with Russia and saying that let's give Putin the benefit of the doubt wants to go study, live and work in the US. And I've never really understood the sort of the duality of that. You know, we culturally look up to the US, we look up to its education system, we want all that, and yet, you know, on social media we'll be saying, "I stand with Putin," hashtag, you know. So that is one thing that has sort of baffled me. So I find that most of the commentary is coming there. I don't find very, with some exceptions, again, in the electronic media, I don't find the coverage is very meaningful or in depth. I do think, however, that one thing that the Indian media is doing better than the Western media is that it's giving you a multi-dimensional perspective on this situation. I think in the West, yes, it's very unidimensional. It's very much from the perspectives of their governments and sanctions, etc. At least you do have voices coming on here from the Russian side who are sort of willing to, to give you that perspective. And I think that that is, at least to my mind, what makes the Indian coverage stand out as compared to the West. So those are my sort of two bits on how it's being fought out in the press today.
Thank you, Nandan. I'll come back to you, but we have lots of. I'm sure I'll open this up for questions and comments from the audience. Vipin, do you want to take over? And once you have questions, perhaps Nandan can come back. So anyone who wants to raise a question, a comment, or observation and want to address it to anyone, please feel free. Anushka, I think, has raised her hand.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm pursuing my master's from Delhi University, and my question is, the discussion is going on that Russia cannot be opposed. India cannot oppose Russia's foreign policy individually, but we can definitely condemn what Putin is doing as a leader. There has to be a difference between a leader opposing a leader and opposing a country. Now, in this conflict scenario, we have clearly demarcated that international institutions are not really equipped enough to handle or oppose individual leaders, while they may be equipped enough to sanction a country as a whole. So then what's the mechanism to discourage individual leaders when they are kind of flexing their muscles under the wagon of, leading a country?
Thank you, Anushka. And anyone else? So Nandan, why don't you address this as well as the point that Nidhi was making about Putin, and I think that's what perhaps you wanted to revert back on.
No, I was not. I am not a Putin fan, so I don't need to defend those. I was trying to point out something else. The reason I was saying that the United States should intervene to stop this war is not because I think that Putin is not an aggressor. That's not the point. I think I made that clear right in the beginning. Nidhi wasn't there, so she probably didn't hear it. But the fact is that this war has been started by Russia because this is a European war about a European security arrangement. And the collapse of the Soviet Union was preceded by a European security engagement, which was evolved between the United States and Russia without Europe. It was done by George Bush Sr. and Gorbachev in Malta. There was no European there, and that was probably the tragedy of it. If Helmut Kohl was there, probably we would not have arrived at where we are today. So my point is that this is another stage where if you, in June 2021, you are willing to recognize that the Russians had legitimate points and therefore the president of the United States went to meet the president of Russia, I don't see why resumption of dialogue cannot be done. I mean, the reason it's not resuming is that the United States is not reaching out to Russia. So it's a very simple thing when I say that United States can stop this war tomorrow, probably, if it decides to intervene. Regarding the question that Anushka raised, I actually do not know this distinction between leader and country and all. I think the world at large has announced sanctions against a country called Russia, which has been announced as an aggressor. When we condemned or abstained or whatever against institutions in international institutions while discussing Ukraine, resolutions were passed for or against a country, not for or against a leader. So I think A, demonizing a leader is not necessarily good policy. B, as long as a leader has the support of the population and the elites in his country, he represents their interests. So I am not willing to accept today. I mean, I'm not saying that Russia is not an aggressor, but I think if you look at the polls, independent polls recognized by even the New York Times and others of Russian public opinion today, a majority of the people, well above 60%, are supportive of President Putin and the war he has launched. They feel that it is an existential threat. They may be wrong. Mass psychosis has also happened in the world. We know many historical cases, but the point is that is what they feel at this point of time. And in foreign policy and everywhere else, we have to deal with the situation on the ground as it exists today. What would have been ideal is always a great thing, but I don't think in his career, Ambassador Raghavan could ever deal with what was ideal. He had to deal with what he had on the table and with the weapons that he had in his hands to deal with those problems.
Thank you. We are running out of time, but I have two hands here on the screen. Namit, why don't you go first?
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Namit. I'm doing my master's from political science from University of Delhi. So my question is that in the present context, how can we safely rely on Russia? Because due to the growing polarization between China and US, there's a growing excess of Russia and China. Russia is wholeheartedly embracing China and ready to be, as someone said, a junior partner with China. So with the growing excess of Russia and China, and given that India's interests are explicitly antithetical to China, how could we safely rely on Russia on this front, in this case?
Thank you, Namit. Ashish, if you want to come in quickly.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashish Dev. I am pursuing my MA for the university. I have basically two questions. My first question is there any chance of our regional organizations like BIMSTEC and SAARC by which we can make an economic power against China, as we can see the current economic world by which we can make a balance of power in China and the Chinese?
Ashish, we can't hear you
and
very
my second
well.
question is,
there is a problem with connection. You're breaking. Your comments are not coming through. If you want to give it another try, just very briefly, if you can recap your question.
So, is there any chance of our regional organizations like BIMSTEC and SAARC by which we can make economic power against China? And my second question is, in coming days, what is the possibilities of weapon market in Europe, Japan, and ASEAN countries? My basic two questions.
Okay, Ashish, I understood the first one, and I'll reframe it for Ambassador Raghavan and then you. Ash, but the final, I think, comment question. Anushka, you want to come in? Very, very briefly.
Yes, sir. So I don't know if I was able to put my point through. I'm not making the distinction between a leader and a country. All I'm saying is that we, as for many foreign policy makers or even a country like India, cannot directly oppose a country as a unit because we are somewhere. A lot of foreign scholars point out that any country's grand strategy requires a consideration on national interest and a lot amount of pragmatism. So we cannot afford to oppose the country. We can only oppose, individual leaders' action. So that's what I was trying to differentiate.
Okay, the point that I think Ambassador Raghavan also made earlier, in the sense that Russia will exist. Putin may, leaders like Putin will come and go, but you have to think about the possibilities of engaging with the country and the reality of that country that exists. Ambassador Raghavan, you want to go first on this question on China?
Yes, thank you. I think the question really was that with Russia getting so close to China, can we actually rely on Russia? You know, Russia getting close to China is a reality. It's a reality that it is being driven into the arms of China, mainly because of its standoff with the West. This is a source of tremendous worry for us. And we have to deal with it the best way we can. And what we are looking to do today, I mean, there are two or three things that we're looking to do. One is, of course, as you say, as we mentioned, you reduce the level of your dependence on Russia in various ways. That is an ongoing proposition. It is not something that can happen overnight. The second point is that as long as Russia does have an ambition of its own, Russia does want to be a great power again after its fade out in the last 20, 30 years. It wants to extract for itself a modicum of independence or modicum of autonomy from China to have its own independent position on the world stage. And there, India is very important to Russia as long as it has that ambition and as long as it can sustain that ambition. And therefore, you know, if we can broad base our relationship with Russia in areas that we do need. I mean, we need the natural resources of Russia. We need the hydrocarbons of Russia that can be mutually beneficial for us because it's even much closer to us. So if we can broad base the relationship in such a way that it's mutually beneficial and where Russia has a stake in the India relationship, its temptation, its compulsion to act with China in manner inimical to India can be diluted. I mean, this is a hope that we have. And as I think it has been mentioned by Nandan as well, if, and this is not inconceivable, if the US-Russia relationship does, the tension in the US-Russia relationship does decrease, that gives Russia a certain room for maneuver, which again makes it easier for us to deal with Russia. So, you know, we have to basically wait for the work towards the international environment changing, well, at least being less against us. And that's the whole manner in which we're dealing with our relationship with Russia. Now, I just want to comment on one thing that Nidhi said, which is actually a factual point, that people in the social media and elsewhere who are arguing for Russia actually have their entire connections with the West. That's an absolute fact. You know, our cultural affinities are with the West, our cultural affinities starting with language and culture and various other connections are with the US. And therefore, my point really is that when you say that you need to handle Russia carefully, these are not emotions out of love or liking. These are hard geopolitical realities. So when you say that I have to deal with Russia, I don't have to love Putin, I don't have to love the Russians, I don't have to love Russia. But as a geopolitical analyst, I say that this is what I need to do. Just as I don't need to love the Saudis, or I don't need to love the Pakistanis, or I don't need to love in order to fashion my policy towards them. So when I say that I have to deal with Russia, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm shunning the West. I have very close affinities with the West. When I say I mean the larger Indian population. So I think there is a distinction between the two. Foreign policy and geopolitics is not built on either love or cultural affinity. It is built on hardcore necessity and hardcore understanding of where your interests lie.
Nandan, your take.
To introduce, I think I wholly endorse what Ambassador Raghavan said, to introduce two lighter notes. One is, I definitely think that the US model is far more attractive than the Russian model. If I was to speak like this in Russia, I'm not sure that I would be speaking very long like this about Russia. So let us be very clear that I think the US model is definitely more attractive. Second point, I know my entire extended family resides in North America. I am not the most popular person in that family for what I say, but I'll have to live with it. I'm saying it because I see things the way I see it. I'm sorry, but that's what it is. The third point I wanted to make, again, since there are many students here, just as a reference for the future, many of those people who today are writing and saying that Russia is a junior partner of China, in the 90s, these are Indian and foreign, in the 90s used to write and say that Russia was a junior partner of the USA. And therefore, India should support the 2003 war because Russia is not going to be with us. US is the sole power, and therefore we should support Indian troops joining the Iraq war. These were the same very people. Okay. So all my point is, let us not preempt history. Who becomes whose junior partner is an evolutionary process, and we will have ample time to see that. This is not clock strikes at 12 and Russia becomes junior partner in China. And as this process starts, as Ambassador Raghavan said, we will keep making those necessary adjustments.
Thank you, Nandan. I think we have overshot our time. Vipin, Nidhi, do you want to come in on anything?
I only want to make a last comment, which is that cultural affinity, of course, is separate from hardcore foreign policy, but I see it becoming more and more intertwined when you see our foreign minister travel to different countries, or when the prime minister takes trips or people visit here. One of the things that countries that India engages with emphasize on is the people-to-people relationship. It's very much, I think that soft power is very much a part of our relationships with different countries. So I think with the US and the UK in particular, that is very much there. I don't know how divorced they are now from our foreign policy objectives. So that's just one sort of final comment before I get back to work. But a very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Nidhi, because I when I raised this point about the future of Indo-Russian relationship, that part of that was on my mind, that if you're looking at the drivers of this relationship, they're getting very, very restrictive. We are only talking about defense equipment all the time. So the relationship that is only unidimensional will face a lot of problems going forward. And I think that's the challenge we have with India-Russia relationship, that, the cultural affinity, the people-to-people ties, there is no bottom-up approach in the relationship. It's all top-down with a very focused approach on defense. And at the, we have tried economic cooperation. It's not working out. Energy cooperation is still less than 1%. So there are lots of issues around India-Russia relationship that I think go beyond this war. And we have been debating and looking at them irrespective of the present crisis. But I think this present crisis perhaps accentuate some of these trends. But that's me. Vipin, over to you to conclude the conversation.
Thank you so much, sir. I believe there are no more questions and we are running out of time. An excellent discussion with all of us. And first of all, I would like to extend my thanks to Ambassador Raghavan for such a nice talk and sharing all of the concerns. My only question which I wanted to put was that, how do we see the liberal order pre-Russia-Ukraine crisis and post-Russia-Ukraine crisis? Because all this while, while this crisis yet was to stage, I was telling my students that don't worry, in a liberal order, this would not happen. And suddenly one fine day, one gets to see that the war had started. So that was some of the rubrics one wanted to understand. That was one observation I want to make. And we all agree that, yes, it's a long trajectory of the geopolitical realities and also on the front of weaponization of what you call as finance, which I always say that when the pocket is strong, when the economy is strong, you can cater to a lot of issues. And similar trend on the propaganda war, which is very common with the entire world order. That is very important. So all of these are there, but on behalf of Delhi School of Transnational Affairs, I would like to extend our thanks to our panelists for this afternoon and my students who have joined in this summer season. And I could see that some of them were seeking out for the connectivity issues because they were not getting connectivity. And that is how less students could join. Otherwise, we have a huge number in the foreign policy term. It goes up to 250 students we were expected to join. But thanks to Ambassador Raghavan, thanks to Nandanji, Nidhi, so grateful to you for joining. and Harsh sir for conducting the session so nicely. You have taken up all the questions, so that's how, less questions were coming in. Otherwise, I think students got satisfied. So the liberal order question is still open for discussion, and we'll definitely take it up. Thanks everyone on behalf of Delhi School of Transnational Affairs, Institution of Eminence, University of Delhi.
Thank you very much. Thank you.